Skillable conducts more unique Azure deployments than any other company on the planet. We are the single largest consumer of Azure subscriptions on the planet in terms of sheer volume. We have, as a matter of fact, we've hit limits within Azure that the Azure team did not know existed. Because at the time they created these features, and I remember having a conversation with one of the team members there not too long ago, actually, where it's like, we hit this limit and they're looking at us going, when we set that number, we just wanted to pick something ridiculously high that no one would ever reasonably reach. And we're sitting there going, "They're cool. Can you double it?" Because of just the scale at which we operate, the pace at which we operate.
In this episode of Petri Dish, we're looking at the story of Skillable, a platform that's designed to help IT professionals build and grow real-world skills. I'm joined by Danny Abdo, who's Chief Operations and Product Officer, and by Corey Hynes, who's Executive Chairman and founder of Skillable. In the conversation, we look at the problem that the company was originally set up to solve, how the platform was built, and how it's evolving to meet the demands of AI in an ever-changing world. If you're not already familiar with Skillable, it's a cloud-based hands-on learning platform focused on immersive real-world practice. It allows organizations to deliver secure, scalable virtual lab environments where users can learn by doing and simulating real-world IT scenarios. But before we get into the conversation, I've got a quick message from the sponsor of today's episode, Caresoft. Active Directory isn't just infrastructure, it's your business. When it fails, everything stops. Caresoft helps you recover in minutes, not days. Visit caresoft.com to learn more. Good morning, Danny and Corey. How are you today?
Doing good.
Doing well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for joining us on Petri Dish today. So, Danny, both of you have been involved in enterprise learning for many years. Danny, through your leadership roles in enterprise learning organizations, and Corey, of course, you are the founder of Skillable and you built the platform. So, before we get technical and talk a little bit about more about Skillable today, I just wanted to ask both of you how you feel this moment right now is a little bit different to shifts that we've seen in the past connected to IT pros and upskilling now that we have AI in the mix. So maybe, Corey, you could answer that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty around what the right answer for things are. I think is the big thing I sense. If I kind of go back to, the era when cloud first became a thing, there was a pattern in the way people approach learning where they just assumed everyone has to, you got to learn cloud. Cloud's a thing. Everyone's got to learn cloud. Now we're in this new era of AI where, there's a new set of skills. There's a new way of thinking. There's new tools. There's, innovation and change at a pace that we've never seen before, and for the enterprise education skills validation space, everyone's trying to figure out what the next sort of right thing is and how do you tackle this. And I think if there's one truth that's become brutally obvious, it's the old methods of read a thing or watch a video are just not cutting it anymore. And we're in this world now where you have to practice with these tools. You have to be able to go in there and put your hands on the tool and experiment and see what works. And in doing so, evolve both your way of thinking about how you do work and your way of thinking about how you interact with software. And I think the folks that are beginning to understand and embrace that are the ones that are starting to have success. So it's a transition away from, if I were to overly and almost offensively simplify it, it's a transition away from procedural based skills to skills that are more iterative and cognitive and based on your ability to go in and use real software to practice real things in real time.
Before I go on to put that question to you, Danny, Corey, so now that not everything, but a lot of things are now cloud-based. Does that make it harder for IT professionals to get that hands-on experience? It's not like, when I was starting out, I went and bought a PC, I loaded Windows Server onto it, I could get hands-on with Active Directory. Is it maybe not so easy anymore?
No, I actually think, if anything, it might be a little easier because, again, I'm really old and I go back to the days of, if I wanted to learn Windows, I had to put a big old server under my desk and spend a week setting it up and play with it. And, now you kind of have infrastructure on demand. So if anything, it's a little bit easier. Now, the challenges are different. In the days of learning operating systems using virtual machines and things of that nature, the challenges you had were, getting hardware, installing software, performance. Today the challenges are a little bit different. They're almost more administrative challenges. How do I, provision an environment, manage my costs, assign my licenses? So I think it's more accessible. I think it is, with the right tool set, easier. It's certainly not challenge free, but the challenges are also very different than they were years ago.
Right. Okay. And Danny, how do you see this moment with AI affecting how people consume and learn and all the rest of it?
Yeah, and I'll sort of answer it from my sort of background in enterprise learning, right? When you think about AI tool sets, there's no doubt. I think the obvious is that the half-life of these tools are very short right now. They're just evolving so quickly. And I think the traditional learning and development cycles that companies have for training and providing training just weren't built for that kind of cadence. So, I think those are some challenges that are happening on that side. I think what's also interesting, coming from, the legacy world, when you think about durable or soft skills and IT skills, they were very separate departments, separate approaches and methodologies for training and building these skills. I think those lines are getting blurred, and I think that's really exciting. I think it's interesting because the people that are getting the most outcomes in applying these new skills in this AI world, it's not just technical, as Corey said, it's not just procedural and knowing how the software works. It's critical thinking, creativity, quality of judgment, all of these other sort of which are a little bit more durable skills. You need those in conjunction with these IT skills to really make, to get these outcomes that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. So I think we'll see more of that convergence. And, it's going to be things like the relationships that, people have with agents and humans to understand problem spaces and identify solutions. It's less about just knowing, how to click through technologies separate from my durable skills. So I think this convergence, and we'll see more evolution in that, down that path.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Corey, let's talk a little bit about how Skillable started. So what was the original problem that you were trying to solve with Skillable?
Skillable kind of started by accident. Several names ago, Skillable as an entity, well, I guess as a name, only came to fruition in 2021. But prior to that, it was Learn on Demand Systems. Prior to that, it was Hall Systems. Prior to that, it was something else. But, the genesis of this whole thing was, back around the turn of the century, which is a fun thing to say. I was writing certification exam questions for Microsoft. Technically, by my ND, I'm not allowed to tell you that, but it was 25 years ago, so I think I'm okay. As part of that whole process, you would have to prove that the correct answers were correct and the incorrect answers were incorrect. And the way we would do this was, take virtual machines and set up copies of, at the time, Windows Server 2000, Windows Server 2003. Mm-hmm. And you'd look, let me conduct an experiment in the live software and kind of show you that, yes, this command does the thing mm-hmm. we said it was going to do. That led to, this is really cool. Can we start using this virtual machine technology for classroom setups, right? In the 90s, when I was a professional trainer, we would spend our weekends running these really long scripts on a classroom full of computers and praying to God that the scripts worked and I got to go home at 4:00. So we transitioned the model to virtual machines are now the deployment methodology. One thing led to another. It's like, okay, so we've got this, big, and, and the old guys will remember what used to be called tech ed. Hey, can we do this at tech ed? Well, that's really cool. Now we're trying to do it at more scale. Can we, instead of putting, big lab images on systems, can we put them in a data center and remote into them? And fast forward, one thing led to another, and this is kind of where we are today. So it's a sort of natural evolution of wanting to provide software environments, initially, and then as you move into sort of the cloud era, wanting to shift the instructional design model from task oriented to now like challenges that are less dependent on consistency in UI and UX because cloud changes all the time. And now being able to layer in evidence that work is done through various scoring methodologies, and now evolving that same principle to how do I give you access to models and agents and tools to allow you to practice skills, but at the same time, still gather evidence that you've done the work, you've got the skill, that we can say with confidence that if I give you a job, you can do it because you've demonstrated proficiency with the software.
Right. Okay. I haven't used Skillable, so I'm just interested to know, you spoke about challenges there. So you mean you might set, the user, whoever's using Skillable, a particular challenge. Does that mean that the platform is able to determine whether it was completed successfully, regardless of how the UI might have changed between last month and this month, or
100%? So, in a very simple example, I want you to be an Azure administrator. Go make me a storage account and encrypt it. And we can assess whether you've completed that using 4 different vectors. The first one is we can ask you questions, right? The old traditional, Q&A type stuff. Secondly is we have a rather robust scripting and automation engine that can interrogate. So we would give you a piece of Azure scoped to you, allowed to do only the thing you're allowed to do, which is create, configure a storage account for a very limited period of time, maybe 30 minutes. This is a technology we built. We call it Cloud Slice. Doesn't really matter what it's called, but you may hear it. You go in there, you create this thing. We can then run a series of scripts behind the scenes and verify that you did the thing we asked you to do. We can also ask you to just display the properties on the screen, and we can use AI computer vision to look at your screen and determine whether or not you did it. We can also, if again, this is all configurable by customers. We can record what you did, and we can analyze the recording later to not just determine if you did it, but did you struggle, right? And assign things like a level of mastery to that skill, right? Are you a beginner? You fumbled your way through it, or did you go right there and do it in 30 seconds and you're an expert?
Okay, wow, that's interesting. Okay, so what you've described sounds like a great idea in principle, and you talked a little bit about how it turned into a platform essentially. But maybe to Danny first, or maybe to Corey, how does building something like that go? How did you assemble a team to go about building and developing something like Skillable, and were there any aspects of it that turned out to be more challenging than expected when you started out?
I'll leave that one for Danny, and I'll pile on some stuff at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
What I would say coming into it, when the core foundation of the platform was built, I think a few things sort of jumped out at me. Just how robust, but I would sort of separate it into 3 pillars, right? What we have is sort of what we call sort of the lab experience. When an end user sort of launches a lab, how is the challenge set up for them? How do they interact with it? How do they go and solve these things? And that in and of itself is a piece of software that we support. Then there's the allowing any company, any customer to build these elaborate lab experiences that will create challenges and engage their learners and author lab experiences on any type of software, really. That authoring in and of itself, that capability is a sophisticated piece of software. I think for me, what I realized, though, maybe the most robust, complex side of what we do is the delivery of these experiences. So building on what Corey was saying, imagine taking these complex environments that have different tools and are configured certain ways and have all this data in it, orchestrating them and then delivering them at scale across the globe on demand. This is more akin to, I put it like your cell phone service when you try to place a call, making sure that it works. And it really sort of the amount of expertise and infrastructure and resources that go into making sure that these labs launch, I would say reliably, securely, and perform at the reliability they do. And we're doing millions of these a year. Just an incredible amount of team and resources go into that sort of pillar of it. So you really have such a wide variety of expertise and team expertise that go into bring this whole thing together so we can provide these experiences. So that sort of lays the foundation, and then feel free to dig in anywhere, Corey, layer onto that.
Yeah, I think it's the old analogy of you turn a key, your car starts, like, wow, big deal, but think of all that goes into making that happen. Sort of some interesting fun facts, right? When you deploy a lab environment, you are essentially conducting an enterprise software deployment exercise. Skillable conducts more unique Azure deployments than any other company on the planet. We are the single largest consumer of Azure subscriptions on the planet in terms of sheer volume. We have, as a matter of fact, we've hit limits within Azure that the Azure team did not know existed, because at the time they created these features, and I remember having a conversation with one of the team members there not too long ago, actually, where it's like, we hit this limit, and they're looking at us going, when we set that number, we just wanted to pick something ridiculously high that no one would ever reasonably reach, and we're sitting there going, "They're cool. Can you double it?" Because of just the scale at which we operate, the pace at which we operate. If you can imagine, someone planning a deployment consisting of databases and maybe a Databricks instance and a couple of virtual machines, all these sort of things. And, they might plan that, run it, operate it, manage it, make sure it goes through. And it might be something a team of people do in a day. We would do hundreds of those in a minute. At our most dense sort of use cases, which are around like these big sort of customer and partner events. But I think, the complexity of doing this and the scale at which we operated at, really is right on the edge of what's possible.
Yeah, sure. It sounds complex. So, Danny, could you walk us through the process, for instance, if an organization or an individual, in fact, comes to Skillable and wants to use it for hands-on learning, or a company needs to train on a new tool, what does that lab experience actually look like from start to finish? And how does it help? Well, how does it help the team build skills, but how would you go about building that lab out if you wanted to train your employees on a particular tool, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, so starting with the authoring side of it, a customer comes to us and says, we want to train or validate or, whatever the use case is, an audience on this tool. A lot of times, because we've been doing this so long, we'll have what's called an environment template. And we'll say, they'll come in and they'll go to the environment template library, pull out that environment, ready to go. They'll make some tweaks to that environment based on their use case and, the business problem or the scenario that they want to build around it. And then they'll move over to our, we'll call it our instructions editor, where they can go, either use AI or build, fully functional editor that they can go build the instructions and guidance to set up the experience for the employees. So they basically got an environment and they've got the guidance that will accompany that environment when the user enters it. And those two things are sort of aware of each other and interact with each other. So they then publish it, to whether, many of the dozens of LMSs we integrate with or different systems we'll integrate with, they'll publish that lab. Now you're over to the end user experience. End user comes in, they click on it. And as Corey mentioned, this, could be a simple environment that loads up, could be a completely, very complex. We've got some labs that for very complex certifications that are 9 hours, and just tons of different challenges and steps with them, all the way down to very short, 5-10 minute experiences. But the end user will launch it. And when they enter that lab, they'll on the right side of the screen, they're going to get sort of what the challenge is, what the experience is. And typically the lab is going to focus on one of three things, right? It's either going to be a learning experience, a practice, sort of scenario, or maybe a more an assessment or a validation experience. And we validate, all the way up to, performance-based testing, high fidelity testing, all the way down to, hey, we want to do a low fidelity skills assessment. And so depending what the scenario is, the user's presented with all of that guidance, and it's interactive, in those instructions. Could be video based. There's AI interactions and all these different things that they'll have, and they'll navigate that live environment. And it could be, could be a cyber scenario of, hey, this environment's getting attacked, go and defend that attack in real time. It could be, whatever the outcome. It could be Excel and Claude, and hey, go build a financial business plan for a company, and give them a specific set of scenarios. I mean, that it's just such a wide array of what those use cases could be. But the end user is navigating a real environment with some guidance to achieve a desired outcome. And then whether we want to validate and automatically validate that outcome, we're able to do so. So that's kind of the a high level pass through of what that experience is from the author and the user side.
Okay, so I think we're all aware that we can all see that the tech landscape is changing very fast with artificial intelligence. So with that change, has AI shifted the skills landscape for IT professionals, and where do you see organizations getting stuck when it comes to keeping their team's skills up to date?
I think there's, I could kind of wax poetically on this topic for days on end. It feels like I've it's been the forefront of thought around what we do and what the world's doing, for quite a while. But I'll focus in on a couple of key points. I think the first one is there is definitely I'll sort of make 2 points and kind of tie back to what we do a little bit, but there's an evolution in the way people think about their job role, just kind of in general, right? And here's how I tend to describe it. That historically people fell into typically one of two categories. You had makers and managers. You had people that went in and they produced output, whether it was code or documents or whatever it might be. And then you had another kind of cohort of individuals that managed the production of output and saw that it went well and it got used in the right way and it got rolled out. And then think of product managers and things of that nature. And what you're seeing now is these roles blend into what I'm calling a coordinator, which is someone that both produces and manages, but they can do this at a scale that's much higher than it was in the past, because now they can coordinate these AI agents that are focused on producing the output. So they now have to bridge this gap of I have to understand the art of making things, but maybe nowhere near to the depth that a maker traditionally would. I also have to understand, the business art of managing this, tying it back to goals and objectives, tying it to true outcomes and results, and navigating this entire ecosystem. And so this person, there's a term that was thrown around for a long time called like a full stack product manager. It's kind of this middle ground where you're no longer focused on one or the other. You're coordinating the efforts of these agents and tools that can run at a pace that is much faster. And so you as an individual have a tremendous impact. Now, what does that mean? It means the impact of that individual is exponentially higher. So the quality of that individual, the skill of that individual has to be exceptionally higher. And what we're seeing is, across the industry, the focus areas that a lot of these companies are honing in on for these kinds of individuals, it's not pure tech, it's not pure management, it's a hybrid of the two, where things like your ability to communicate well in language, because you're communicating not only with people but with agents and operators, right? And the language of building things is now plain English or whatever your language is, versus writing code necessarily. Now, that's sort of the transformation that is happening. Where does that tie back to kind of Skillable? Well, it ties back us a couple of different ways. The first one is, at the end of the day, like while all that's changing, the core of what we do, which is provide safe spaces to practice skills in software, really hasn't. The software has evolved. There's arguably now more human beings that need to do this. right? Because it's not just the engineers interacting with software; it's everyone in the org chart interacting with software. So there's more people that need to do this. They need to arguably operate in safer spaces because the risk if something goes wrong is much higher. Because there's many companies that are one wrong prompt away from breaking production code. So the need for what we do and the way that people are starting to apply what we do, if anything, is getting bigger, more important, getting more attention, right? Because of this need to be able to operate in truly safe spaces, to be able to validate skill in sometimes subjective ways, right? The software is evolving, the tool sets are evolving, but this fundamental thing of if you're going to do a job, I've got to be able to go in there and put my hands on the real thing and practice with the real thing and get some evidence that I know how to do it before I can be trusted to do it at scale. That's becoming more predominant, if anything.
Yeah. To build onto that, I think one thing to hone in on what Corey said, when you have AI now handling the execution layer, I think like the overall human value shifts upwards. But it's not focused on execution. It's focused on a higher, more complex skill set. Understanding how these systems fit together. What are the security implications of doing it? How to determine of what AI is executing is correct. All of these different things. So it's a much more complex, sophisticated skill set, and I think you're going to need a much more sophisticated, complex training environment to support your people and your employees through that, because you're throwing in tools and technologies, you're throwing in agents, they've got to coordinate with people. You want to give them more complex problems to be able to solve with all of these. How are you going to do this? By watching a video or reading a book about training? Like you need to create these immersive environments if you're going to allow people to experiment and evolve to unlock the value that's now possible.
To give you like a bring this back to kind of to earth a little bit, because we can get philosophical on this. Within Skillable itself, right? Our engineers, like if you go back 2 years, we had engineers, we had lead engineers, and we had product managers. The product managers were the managers, and the engineers were the makers. And those roles are completely blended now. And if we look back and go, like, what are the skills that this new cohort of individual needs, right? Well, in the past, the engineers, they would learn through traditional labs and hands-on software training how to do all their stuff. The product managers, it's more soft skills, right? Now, all of these individuals are producing code. They're producing it in different ways at different levels, but now the product managers who ordinarily would not have produced code or interacted with the technical end of things, now are doing that same sort of level of skill validation. They're absorbing some of the skill set of engineers, but as Danny said, just at a bit of a higher level. So the number of people that are, for example, within Skillable that are training on labs as a safe space to go practice building things with AI and mastering those sort of new ways of thinking and the nuance of doing it. There's more people today doing that than there was 2 years ago, because we've empowered another layer.
Yep. So let me bring it back down to some kind of more basic level. So, in things like Azure, for instance, we're used to, kind of a point and click interface to do things. Or if you're really adventurous, you might write some PowerShell code or, some Bicep or some Terraform to roll out some infrastructure, for instance. Do you see a point where AI and natural language might actually take over either of those things? Or is that kind of low-level configuration still too critical to trust to AI? I guess I put that to, well, whoever wants to answer that.
Yeah, I'll answer that one quickly, which is it already has. Right, that's not a future state. That's almost a past state. Even within our own platform, we don't expect you to write Bicep or ARM. You can prompt your way to those things. Now, it's still incumbent upon the human in the middle to make sure that these things do what they're intended, and to troubleshoot to make sure it works. But this notion of creating by hand those sort of legacy artifacts, like that is a thing of the past. We have customers that are doing some really creative things. At the end of the day, like our platform takes things like bicep files and ARM templates and other with AWS's CloudFormation, Google's Terraform, et cetera, takes all these sort of artifacts that represent the description of the software environment and deploys and manages them at scale. How you get to that artifact is entirely up to you. Some people write it by hand. The majority of our customers, they prompt their way to those artifacts, right? So this idea of natural language prompt to infrastructure, it's already commonplace.
So it sounds like sorry, I was just going to say that it sounds like Skillable has already evolved to deal with that scenario, if I understood.
Yeah, and what I was going to do. Yeah, and what I was going to do is share like an example. So how would that manifest in a lab experience? Whereas, say, 5 years ago, we would be setting up an environment and validating and allowing somebody to write that script, let's say, and then we would go check to see if that script ran and those types of things. How that might look different is allow them to use AI to solve the problem, and then we're assessing. We might throw something in there where the AI gets something wrong. Were they able to detect that thing? Were they able to correct it before they deployed it? So you're assessing, judgment, their ability to observe and make the right decisions. So it just shifts sort of what we're assessing, in that lab experience a little bit. And again, I think the summary is it moves from like looking at procedures and being able to follow procedures to outcomes. And being able to validate that they're getting to those outcomes at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because what you described, Corey, if I'd gone into let's say an exam room 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, and up comes a question, and I tried to, I don't know, read in a book under the table or Google on my phone the answer, it would have been considered cheating. So I guess where I'm going with this is there not a fear that we're going to lose those core skills of actually how to write a PowerShell script to do X, Y, or Z, or how to, understanding the actual concepts of how all of this stuff actually hangs together?
I have 3 comments on that. The first one is, you've been around in IT a while, correct?
Yes.
Do you remember how to do subnetting by hand?
No.
Can you deploy networking on Azure?
Not off the top of my head, no.
But if you were to go into the Azure portal and set up a network and some routing tables, you could probably pull it off, right? My point is that some skills just age out over time.
Right.
And I think to a degree, and I don't believe this is around the corner, although I could certainly be wrong. Skills like writing complex JSON files will probably age out over time. Skills like writing complex scripting and automation tools may very well age out over time. So will they go away? Maybe. Is that a bad thing? Probably not. I mean, the level of abstraction we have in technology today is so far removed from what it was even when I got started. I can remember the last time I configured an autoexec.bat file. I'm dating myself for sure now. To your second point about exams and cheating, right, is looking under the table at a book while you're doing an exam cheating. I mean, I don't know. Depends on the person defining what the objective of the exam is. I don't think it is, right? If the objective of the exam is to prove you can achieve an outcome, who cares, right? And in fact, like Microsoft in a number of their exams, I don't know if it was Microsoft, but we do certification exams for a lot of different companies, but a lot of them, the internet's a tool you have during the exam because the internet's a tool you have during your job. Just like AI is a tool you have during your job. So I think, for a lot of those things, it's not a matter of black and white. It's a matter of what it is you're trying to assess, what it is you're trying to achieve, what it is you're trying to prove, and what's the tool set you expect a person to have to do it. There will certainly be certification exams and badges and credentials that you're expected to do it from up here. There will be those that say you can have every tool at your disposal because all I care about is if I put you in a chair in a job in a desk in an office or whatever, and I say go build me X, that you can go build X. And if you happen to use AI to do it, cool. It just means you're more efficient than the guy next to you.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when I used to interview people or be part of a group who was interviewing somebody. You ask them a particular question which might demonstrate do they know the technology or not. And, you have a candidate who might sit there and say, yeah, I don't know how to do that. Or you have a candidate who says, well, I don't know how to do that, but this is what I would go and do to find out how to do that and how I would approach solving this problem. This is the guy that you're going to employ, not the guy who just shrugs his shoulders and says, yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, the guy you hire in that scenario is the guy that says, I would go take a Skillable lab and master this.
Exactly. So we talked a lot about AI and changes, and it seems a lot of these changes are already have already happened and are still in the process of happening. So if we were to look ahead to the next kind of couple of years, this is a very fast moving area. Could you make any predictions about where you might see all of this evolving even further than it already has?
My prediction is anyone that tries to predict what's going to evolve in the next 24 months is probably making a mistake. I would say 6 to 12 is probably a fairly far horizon at the rate we're going.
Okay.
Look, I think, I've been in this industry now for damn near 30 years. And, if anything is consistent, it's the fact that stuff changes rapidly all the time. Right. Mm-hmm. And, there are certainly principles that don't change, such as, the only way to truly master skill is to do it. Right, is to go in and practice it and to repeat it, regardless of what those skills are. I am far better with Claude Code and Codex today than I was 6 months ago because I've used it a lot. Mm-hmm. Right, mm-hmm. Those foundational principles of you learn by doing, you learn by repetition, you learn by practice. It doesn't matter how software evolves for a human being. That's the only answer, and it always will be the only answer. What will evolve is what the things you do look like and the tools and software that you use to do that, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And as more and more people, as software becomes more accessible to more and more people, for me as the founder and former CEO of a company that, built its foundation on empowering people to learn by doing, I love it. Like I look forward and I just see the world as my oyster and just more opportunity to do and transform more things. The vision of this company from day one was, you learn by doing. You start with hands-on and supplement, right? And the further, we move forward in time and the pace that we're going, the more that's actually becoming a reality.
Yeah. So on a personal note for each of you, I'll start with Danny. What are you most excited about in the future of skill development?
Yeah, I think what we've been talking about, with AI, at the end of the day, it's really sort of elevating human potential, to be able to do incredible complex things, to improve the world in ways we could have never sort of imagined. And so to sort of be able to sit adjacent to that. It's exciting and it's an honor to provide a platform that can evolve with the speed at which technology is evolving and providing, the platform for people to explore, learn, practice, and evolve these skills as fast as these skills are changing, right? And to be part of that mm-hmm. progress it's an incredibly exciting time. And I'm looking forward. As Corey said, I don't know what the next 24 months look like, but I know that, Skillable is going to be right there beside it, providing, the platform to support the progress. So that's what excites me.
For me, it's a little more tangible, and it's the level at which we are going to be able to provide personalization is very exciting. With the advent of large language models, in particular, and the advent of being able to train agents on customer data, every experience a person can have a degree of relevance to both what they mm-hmm. do and can be at the level that they need in a way that was incredibly difficult to achieve in the past. Mm-hmm. Traditional learning involves instructional designers speculating what the attendee is going to need and then trying to cover all their bases. Modern learning design is driven by the learner where you give them a framework that guides them down a path, but they have the freedom to explore up or down the difficulty levels based on what they need, not just holistically, but at the individual topic and task level. That to me is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I guess everybody has a different way that they would like to learn something in principle. I mean, I like kind of bottom-up learning or reverse engineering things, whereas other people might like to start with a high-level concept and, work their way from there. So I think the idea of, being able to move up and down the ladder, and to kind of personalize the experience sounds like a really fantastic thing too. All right, so obviously we can go to skillable.com to find out a bit more, but is there any one thing that we should, do with the platform to get familiar with it? Or what would you suggest, either for an individual or for an organization looking at using Skillable? Where would be the best place to kind of start investigating? Put that to Danny.
Yeah, I would say experience it, get hands-on with it. I think taking a lab, finding something that you're interested in learning. We have a whole library of labs that we have in our marketplace. You can go to the marketplace, purchase a lab, experience it for yourself. I think it answers more questions than anything you're going to read, on the website. Just to go ahead and experience the lab.
Okay, great. Well, I'd really like to thank you both for joining us today. I've definitely learned a lot about Skillable, and I'm quite keen to go and investigate what you've got on offer over there. It sounds really interesting. So thank you very much for your time.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay. And thank you for watching today's episode. Do go and check out Skillable. I'd like to thank our sponsors of today's video, Caresoft, once more. But that's it from today, and we'll see you next time.